You are listening to Science Coast with Mallory Havens and
Chris White.
And today our guest is
Dominic Colonna.
Dominic, tell us your role at the university.
I'm a theology professor. I've been here since 1999, and I like to teach classes about theology and culture. That means theology and faith, or rather faith and art, and faith and science.
Awesome. Today, we're going to talk about the intersections of faith, religion, and science. And there's a lot of misconceptions out there. There's a lot of people who think that it's not possible to be a hardcore scientist while also being a person of faith and believing in, for example, Catholicism. But I'm a Catholic and I'm a scientist, and I've never really thought that there was much problem with being both at the same time. But there's a lot of interesting ideas out there, so I thought we'd have a conversation about that today.
Yeah, I think a lot of people compartmentalize. Woo, I got that word out. When they're those parts of their brains. At least that's how I viewed it when I was a child. That's probably evolved now as an adult. But Dominic, what do you think?
Well, you know, in the course, we kind of review the idea that...
What course? You said the course.
The course Science and Faith, which is a team-taught course with people from the natural sciences and occasionally from the social sciences. And we use a textbook that suggests there's a variety of responses to the relationship between science and faith. John Haught's the author of a book called Science and Faith, and he suggests three basic models. One is that science and faith, or people who believe in science and faith, suggest there's a conflict between the two and they're irreconcilable. Then he suggests, and this is a common idea, the idea of non-overlapping magisteria, something that was developed by Stephen Jay Gould. I think he was a biologist a long time ago.
The name's familiar. An
entomologist, I think. And the suggestion there is that there are two different modes of meaning in the world. One is scientific and one is more theological or faith-based. And many people, you use the phrase putting on hats. Mm-hmm. One colleague came into the class and I said, how do you reconcile being a scientist with your strong Christian faith that's almost creationist? And he said, when I come to work, I put on one hat. When I go home, I put on a different hat. So that would be non-overlapping magisteria, two different ways of teaching. And then the third is this conception of convergence, that there's actually something that science can teach theology to help it become deeper and better. And at the same time, there's something that theology can teach science to make it deeper and better.
I feel like the hat theory, different hats, is you have to be in some sort of self-denial or one part of your brain denying the other. I like more the concept of convergence because that seems more intellectually honest to me.
Also, I think the different realms have different places. The notion of proving the existence of God. Science is always about hard facts. And so science is always about reproducibility. We're going to create theories that we can then test. And for me...
Some of us call them hypotheses.
Hypotheses?
Yes, that we test.
Okay. So the notion that you can do experiments to prove whether God exists or not, I think is a fool's task. And the first time this ever happened was when I was a college student down at the University of Illinois, and my two roommates wanted to stay up until 3 a.m. and have a long conversation, and they were going to prove to me that God could not exist through rational, logical arguments. But I just think that just doesn't work. It just doesn't work, and you can neither prove nor disprove the existence of God, in my opinion.
We teach that, or I teach that in Gen Bio 1, where I say you can't use experiments or the scientific method to test anything supernatural or matters of faith. Would you agree with that?
I would, absolutely. And in philosophy, in the philosophy discipline and theology, we would say exactly what you said, Chris, that you can't prove or disprove. And this is since the time of Immanuel Kant, who talked about the limits of reason. So we do have historically a figure like St. Thomas Aquinas who offers proofs for the existence of God. And they would seem to be irrelevant today. But the fact is they're very relevant because they give you reasons to believe, not necessarily proofs. So you're using reason. And theology is an academic discipline that uses reason. It's faith-based. It appreciates the resources that a particular faith provides. But it doesn't attempt to conclude absolutely. Where I think it's similar, what I've been learning teaching science and faith is two words are familiar or similar. One is that we need to be humble in our statements. That's true even of scientists, the recognition that there's still something more that could be known. There might need to be a correction. And the other is mystery. Mystery seems to be more a feature of theology. We're driven by or drawn by a desire to know more, but that's actually true of science as well.
Right.
So this notion of being drawn to know more, and the question is, how do you know more about a deity such as, the Christian God? Is it something that you just simply have to accept as being true because somebody else told it to you? And so how do you, as a theologian, guide people in pursuing theological truth?
Well, there's a phrase that oftentimes scientists will roll their eyes about, and we talk about not only knowledge that comes through your head, but through your heart or through your gut. I think, Mallory, did you just roll your eyes, Mallory?
No, I didn't.
And so, when we make an appeal to the average person, they will talk about, it doesn't make sense, but I feel it in my heart, and so this is going to be the right thing to do. And people will agonize over that. In my experience as a contemporary theologian, I see that there's a place. I was drawn to theology because I wanted to know answers why things happened, or why particular religious beliefs were true in the Catholic community. I myself am a Catholic Christian. And it turns out that a lot of the reasons are historically based. They're situational. And so in each time and place, in each paradigm, people develop a different set of reasons to justify their faith. There's certainly an element of heart for me, but I'm largely drawn to the intellectual component of it. So how could someone believe today? There's an area of theology, very complex, I'll use a new term, apologetic.
Oh, no, that sounds sad.
No, apologetic is not apologizing for your faith. It's actually traditionally called the defense of the faith by using reason.
Okay.
And so what it appeals to is that in each generation, each religious community needs to understand the reasons for the faith that they have.
Okay. Like, what would be an example of the reason for, say, Catholicism today?
Well, one of my favorite composers, one of my favorite theologians, Colonna, who's a bit dated now, died in the 80s, but popular through the middle of the 20th century, he suggested that a contemporary notion of God is to think of God as not far away. The word transcendence is usually used to talk about God, and that oftentimes is described as really, really far away or really, really big. Instead of being distant, Colonna suggests that God is immanent, present to you in a way like no other things. So when we look to find God, and again, this might sound a little romantic or sentimental, we should look inside ourselves instead of outside of ourselves.
So that's really interesting, this notion of inside yourself, looking internally. And there's a lot of feelings and emotions, which I think science and psychology and biology are struggling to try to understand, the whole notion of consciousness and good versus evil. And how do you even define that scientifically? So when I think of my Catholic faith, I think of a way of life. One of the things that defines me as a Catholic is a perception, how I frame the world, how I frame my actions. And then ultimately, my reading of the Bible says that the foundation for being a Christian is love. And I had a email conversation with my pastor in the past week. And one of the things that I was commenting about in my email is how can you scientifically prove whether love exists or not? So if there are these aspects of consciousness and emotion and morality that are the realm of religious faith, in my opinion. And as a scientist, I can't quite understand how I can apply my tools as a scientist to try to resolve or even understand that part of my life.
Yeah, you see, I would go to the social sciences for that. I would talk about psychology and perhaps even sociology. I'm sure that there are biological examinations of this, but there's probably more done in other areas. I think that for me, and I was talking to a philosopher about this the other day, a really important word to understand how we make sense of things in the way you're talking, Chris, is discernment. We could talk about a discerning palate. Somebody can taste a food, and you could know everything that's, every ingredient that made it up. My wife has that skill.
I find food to be edible or inedible.
And there's no discerning palate where you can tell what's in there. Is there cumin in there or not? But in philosophy and theology, discernment is a really important part of critical thinking. Kind of an overused phrase these days, but really important for thinking about faith. Discernment, I break it down into several parts. One is perception. And so that's really crucial. Can we perceive things properly? Because if our perception is clouded, if the information is coming to us through a filter that clouds what's actually there or what we can see from our position, our perspective, then it will ruin the final judgment that we make. Then after perception, there should be reflection. You should think about something. So I'm thinking of, let's say, a biblical text. We could read a selection of the Bible where it says, in the story of the Good Samaritan, we hear this claim about the great commandment of love in Luke's gospel. And we want to know, did Jesus really say that? And there's actually a science of trying to analyze, was Jesus the one who said these words? Was it likely? We call it textual criticism or historical criticism. So we have perception, we read the words, reflection, we sort of do some sort of analysis, and then we have to interpret it. We have to sort of make it make sense for our particular situation here and now. And only then do we make a judgment. Perception, reflection, interpretation, which often involves imagination, and then a judgment. I know, does that make sense, Chris?
It makes sense to me. I always say every situation has three truths. Your version of what happened, my version of what happened, and then what actually happened that neither of us can know because our perception clouds it.
Yeah, one thing I like about Karl Rahner is he's really, that's a modern problem. We call it the problem of plurality. And Rahner's suggestion, again, very simplistic, is that we learn more by talking to people to see their multiple perspectives. So the classic image is the image of the blind people who are touching the elephant. And each person individually describes a part of the elephant that they touch, but collectively they have a better understanding. But for Rahner, I love this phrase, for Rahner, the actual nature of God, the reality of God, remains an asymptotic goal of human striving. We can look at the perspectives of all different peoples at all different times, but what God is ultimately will elude our grasp. Chris, what's an asymptotic goal of human striving? What's an asymptote?
Well, and from a mathematical perspective, it's a function that approaches a particular value but never actually reaches it. So it is an accurate and precise word for what you're describing, in my opinion.
3.33333 repeat bar.
Yeah, well, I picture in my head an asymptotic graph.
Okay,
where the line is approaching zero but never quite gets there.
Right.
And it just goes on into infinity. And this is what we're often told as Christians is that our human condition is such that we can never truly understand God and God's greatness. And so for me, it's just, as a scientist, I'm like, okay.
What I was really curious about what you said earlier is that theology has something to teach science about how science is conducted. How do you see that, or how would you describe that?
Well, the image, the metaphor, the image that I just gave now, I think is perhaps the most basic, and that's where I've come to understand the concept of humility and mystery. Mystery draws us towards that asymptotic goal. Humility makes us realize that we'll never fully fully capture it. And I think that's easier to see in theology. There is a tendency, or there's a claim from some religionists, people who have a faith, that sometimes scientists see science as its own religion, and they're not open to the humility that's necessary. But ultimately, if you scratch the surface of any true scientist, they will say, no, the quest continues. It's never final and complete.
That's why we try to say like supported and refuted, not definitive answers, because we know that with our limited viewpoint, we might not be able to understand the full picture, and that will have to be modified as technology improves and we do more experiments.
I just want to touch one more time on this notion of mystery, because what it reminds me of is this notion of being able to work in gray. And there are some people who want definitive. They want yes, no, very clearly articulated, this is what it is, and there's no mystery associated with what it actually is, because we just simply don't know. And from a scientific perspective, there are lots of scientists who have challenges associated with, uncertainty. We simply don't have enough information. We simply don't understand enough to be able to resolve this issue, so we're just going to accept the fact that it's a mystery. And sometimes, data tells us two different things and we're not quite sure, and it's an anomalous result, and then we just kind of wait until we get more data and then we figure it out. I'm usually pretty okay with that. That's why I responded earlier. It's like, I'm told that I'm not capable of truly understanding the nature of God. Okay, I'll accept that for now as we collect additional information. I reserve the right to change my mind later, but for now, I'm comfortable living in gray.
The thing I think is hard for me to view is I'm totally open to the idea of like higher powers and stuff, but I don't know how people pick one. Like, other than you were raised in it, but how do you know that yours is the right God when there are billions of people who believe in something else?
Yeah, that's where I think I'll use a phrase that one author uses, sophisticated theologians. And in a way, I'm sounding a little elitist here, but there's the recognition that, again, with humility, everybody's looking at things from their own perspectives, and that includes from a temporal or spatial point of view. Time and space, we're looking at things differently. So
maybe it's just your perception. It's all the same God, and we just all have different filters.
Right, but then to get back to what Chris is saying, I think the real challenge, I think you're dead on about this notion of the problem of gray and black and white. The challenge in theology is if people are left with too much gray, sometimes they lose their sense of self. They lose their personal and communal sense of identity. What is right? What should I do? Are LGBTQ rights important? Some Christians are because the Bible says some explicit things, some hateful things, that I have to believe black and white, the literal interpretation of the Scripture. Other people will say, no, it's Jesus gives us this fairly vague directive. We should love one another, love God with all your heart and soul, and love
Thy neighbor.
Thy neighbor as thyself. Thank you very much. I have a PhD, but I forget.
I don't. Me too. Okay, with that, the views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are the speaker's own and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of Lewis University. The material and information presented here is for general information purposes only. The Lewis University name and all forms and abbreviations are the property of its owner, and its use does not imply endorsement of or opposition to any specific organization, product, or service. This podcast was produced in the WLRA podcast studios at Lewis University. Visit lewisu.edu for more information about Lewis University. This has been Science Coast with Mallory Havens and
Chris White
and
Dominic Colonna.
Thanks.
Bye.